The Wildcat. It might not have been the best carrier-borne fighter aircraft of the Second World War, but they certainly got their money's worth from it. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Academy Wildcat in 1/72 scale. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic. In this video I'm going to be focusing on what this kit is like to build and rounding off with a review at the end. I'll put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy replicating what you see here. And with no further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I'll cut the parts away from the sprue using my cutters, and then sand down any rough areas of plastic or remove excess flash with a sharp knife. Whilst this is a slightly older tooling, the level of flash is actually quite manageable. Tamiya Extra Thin Cement will be my glue of choice throughout this project, and my first step was to glue the pilot's seat into the cockpit. This has a slightly unusual design where the seat effectively hangs from the rear of the cockpit. A control column is included, and this was glued into the weird little hook at the front of the pilot's seat. Definitely one of the strangest cockpits I've built so far. To paint the cockpit I'm going to use this Humbrol Rail Colour 410, which is a Monsal green. It might not be the most accurate colour, but I think it'll do. This was painted over all of these internal areas, with a couple of thin coats being needed to get a good level of opacity. The included pilot figure would then be glued into place, and I've already painted him off camera using my normal techniques. There are a couple of windows beneath the pilot on both sides of the fuselage which needed to be glued in here. A small amount of Tamiya Extra Thin Cement allowed to wick around the edge should hold it nice and securely. The engine has a rather simple design. The shaft for the propeller gets inserted into the main backplate component, and then the front of the engine is glued over the top. This means the propeller can be added at the end of the build, but should freely rotate. The engine assembly could then be glued into one of the fuselage halves. With that done, the fuselage halves were joined together. The fit here is generally quite good, but I did decide to sand down the seam line just a little bit to help make it a little bit neater. Now onto the wings. The wings come in two halves, with the upper and lower parts needing to be joined together. There is no folded option, so you will have to have your wings in the extended position. On the lower side of one of the wings, I did make sure to glue in the pitot tube. These wings were then glued into their slots on the side of the fuselage. The fit here is generally okay, and I found I didn't need to use any filler. The two tail surfaces were attached to the rear of the aircraft in the same way, and then I moved to the front of the aircraft and glued on the front of the engine cowling. Because this kit comes with a display stand, I'm going to display this aircraft in a flying pose. This central part of the landing gear bay was installed, and the wheels would simply be glued into the two holes either side of this part. There are a couple of fuel tanks which come in two halves and are joined together, and on the top I attached the aerial mast. As mentioned, a display stand is included, so I glued the arm into the base. Now turning to the cockpit canopy, some Humbrol Clearfix was used to glue it into position. I've already masked the canopy using my normal method, which is to apply tape and then cut along the canopy framework. Humbrol Clearfix should dry clear and strong and not react with the plastic. And now it's time to prime. A product I've been enjoying recently is this Army Painter Black Primer. This comes in a rattle can and was sprayed over the aircraft, the display stand and the propeller. Next, Army Painter Primer in white was sprayed onto the lower surfaces of the aircraft, as well as the external fuel tanks. According to Academy's painting instructions, this has a white lower side, and I thought this would simply be the easiest way of priming the aircraft and getting the correct colour. For the upper surfaces, Academy suggests a blue-grey colour, but doesn't tell you which one in particular. I thinned down this medium blue from Tamiya with some of their acrylic thinner. This was loaded into the airbrush, and then I tried to carefully spray it onto the upper surfaces. I did mask around the tail area, just so that the tail surfaces would be nice and neat, but for the other surfaces I would try and freehand this. I'm not sure I quite got the air pressure correct, or the ratio for thinning the paint, because it came out quite speckly. It's not the neatest paintwork that I've ever done, so to tidy it up I loaded into the airbrush this RAF white from Outlaw Paints, and then went back over some of the areas to try and neaten up the edges between the colours. This paint does have a slightly more yellowy finish to it, so I actually used it a little bit on the bottom of the aircraft to almost add little bits of highlights and modulation to the paint colour. One thing I had done earlier, after the black primer, was mask the walkways at the wing roots for the crew to access the cockpit. So after all this painting was done, I removed those masks. In preparation for the decals, I'm going to clear coat the model using this custom service satin. This should give a nice smooth surface for the transfers to be applied to, and should hopefully avoid any silvering. And speaking of the decals, you get one small sheet of transfers, which I dunked in some warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you get your cup of tea confused with your brush water, why not get a brush water mug so you don't make that mistake again? It helps support the channel, and you can find them in my merch store. So I've been out and bought a couple of products that I'd like to experience, and these are the VMS Decal Set and Fix and Decal Softener. So first up, the Decal Set and Fix was painted onto the places where the transfers were going to go. This should supposedly help to soften them onto the surface and also act a bit like an adhesive. The transfers, having been soaked in warm water, were then slid into position with a little bit of manipulation to get them in the right place, and then they were pressed down slightly into the surface. The decal application stage was really quick because there's only a handful of decals, and I found that they applied to the model quite well. I have struggled with Academy decals in the past because they seem to be a bit inconsistent and sometimes are quite thick. These ones though appear to be of the thinner variety, and with the VMS decal softener applied over the top, they actually settled into the surface details rather nicely. So yeah, decal application on this kit was pretty straightforward. There are a few little bits that need to be painted, so some gunmetal paint was carefully applied onto the engine on the nose of the aircraft, taking care to avoid getting it on any of the other painted surfaces, and then some polished metal was used to paint the pitot tube on the lower side of the aircraft. I would also use this to paint the centre of the propeller. For the yellow flashes on the tips of the propeller, I used some Humbrol No. 24 Trainer Yellow. Vallejo Black was used to carefully paint the tyres on the wheels, which were glued onto the side of the aircraft. I did need to make sure not to forget the tyre on the wheel at the back of the aircraft as well. The custom service satin varnish makes a reappearance here, and a small amount was used to go over the top of the decals. They've had enough time now to cure, and this should help protect them, seal them in, and prepare them for the next step. The next step is a little bit of weathering. I've got this Humbrol blue-grey enamel number 79, and this is my favourite product at the moment to make a homemade wash. It was thinned down with some white spirit until it created a really thin paint. This was then painted over most of the aircraft, but I did take care to avoid the clear parts. I have experienced in the past where the white spirit can sort of leak into the clear parts and cause them to fog up slightly. So to avoid that, I'm just going to not paint those areas with this wash. It is my hope that the satin varnish I've applied earlier should allow all of this wash to accumulate in the recessed details and help add a level of grime and dirt and almost an extra three-dimensional effect to the model. I would do a little bit of chipping as well. That polished metal paint I used earlier was loaded onto a brush and almost kind of dry brushed over a few areas and stippled to make it appear as though the paintwork has been chipped away whilst the crew have been working on the aircraft and removing panels and things like that. With all of that done, this K-Colors XW10 matte varnish was loaded into the airbrush and then applied over the entire model. This should help dull down that satin varnish and give it a more flat look. Once I'd finished clear coating the model, I would add a couple of drops of black to the matte varnish to create a very thin black paint. This was then used to carefully simulate smoke staining from the gun ports and other areas of the engine. Working in the direction of airflow, I would build up the paint to try and give the impression that some areas have left some residue in the direction of airflow. I made sure to glue on the underwing tanks in the holes. These holes are always present, so you would have to fill them in if you didn't want the aircraft to have them. When that was dry, I would glue the propeller onto the shaft on the nose. And then I carefully peeled away my homemade masks, which appear to have done a pretty good job. And then I attached the included display stand. Again, the hole on the bottom is always present and is part of the moulding. And with that, I'm going to call my build of the Academy Wildcat in 1/72 scale complete. And that's another build under the belt. So the Academy Wildcat was actually the first Academy kit I built in my youth, and I remember it being pretty good. And there are still some good aspects about this kit, but there are some things now that I have a little more experience that I realise makes it possibly not one of the most accurate model kits out there. So I'm going to talk about some of the less positive things and then swing into the better aspects of the kit. So one thing I didn't particularly like was the fact that this doesn't come with that many options. Other kits out there today do come with options to display the wings folded, or perhaps with flaps lowered, but in this case what you see is what you get. You do get the option to have the landing gear raised or lowered, which I quite like because a display stand is included. A pilot was also included, but the pilot was very crude, but I don't think that matters because he's pretty much hidden behind the cockpit canopy. There was a little bit of flash on my particular example which had to be cleaned away, and there are a few little seams in places which I could have paid a little more attention to. An area that Academy could improve on this is to include more information in their instructions and also printing them in colour. An example would be that they have told us that the paint on the upper surfaces should be a blue-grey. As to what kind of paint, I'm not entirely sure. I went with something that looked about right that I had in my stash, but with a little bit of hindsight and a little more research, it probably should be a little bit more grey than it is blue. Also, you're not told what aircraft this represents, and I have done a bit of digging and I think that I've found out which aircraft this is supposed to represent. As you can see, this is supposedly meant to be an FM1 version and not an F4F. It's my understanding that the primary difference here would be that the outboard machine guns were not present on the FM1, so it would have only had 4 50 cals rather than 6. So it's not quite the right variant for the paint scheme they've included. I think dimensionally it's a little questionable as well. Whilst the Wildcat was quite a chunky plane, this seems to be a little bit more pronounced in its chunkiness. I also think the propeller shaft is a little bit too long and the propeller sits a little too far away from the engine cowling. Oh, and let's not forget as well that inside of the cockpit there's basically nothing other than a chair, which just dangles from the inside of the fuselage, which is a strange way of doing things. So let's swing back to the more positive aspects of this kit. I think the level of detail is fairly good. It does have some recessed panel lines and some rivets in places, and whilst some of the details might be a little bit chunky externally, I think if you're quite new to the hobby, this will give you good opportunity to practice techniques such as chipping and panel line washes. I thought that the decals applied to the model really nicely. These do seem to be the thinner kind of decals that Academy use, but the VMS fluid that I used also made them settle into the surface details really well, so I'm pretty happy with that. The kit only comes with 35 parts, which means that you can make really quick progress. And whilst I did make a note in my modelling journal, and you can pick up your own modelling journals to keep a track of your own builds on your workbench by checking the links below the video, in here I did say that this one took me just about 2 days. Realistically, I think you probably could do this in a day, given that it only has effectively a 2-tone paint scheme, a low part count, and only a handful of transfers. So this could be pretty good for a mojo build, or maybe even suitable for a beginner who'd like a little bit more practice before moving on to a more serious version of the Wildcat. So that brings us round to the price. It's a little bit difficult to find a recommended retail price for Academy kits because they don't seem to advertise them. I paid £6.65 for mine, which seems to be about average when I compare this to other retailers online. I have seen it retailing for cheaper than this, but I would say if you're spending more than £7 or £8 for this, it's certainly not worth it, considering there are more modern toolings out there for around a similar price. And speaking of the tooling age, it's my understanding that this dates from 1987, with the version I have here being in production since 2019. Whilst there have been other boxings of this kit, effectively what you see here is what there always has been and probably always will be. It's a little bit annoying that Academy has a picture of a built model on the outside of the box in a different paint scheme, but that's not the one that's included. And I don't think it ever has been included. So yeah, I think it's probably time to wrap this one up. This is a kit that's probably showing its age a little bit, and there are definitely improvements that Academy could make if they want to keep this in their range and up to the kind of modern standards that we expect to see from kit companies today. That being said though, this is a fairly budget kit which looks mostly like a Wildcat, is quick and simple to build, and didn't present too many challenges. I think if I were to build this one again, I would try and get a more accurate shade for the upper surfaces, or in fact maybe even some aftermarket decals and do it in a different paint scheme. Compared to some of the other Academy kits I've experienced, this one was not the worst. And with that, I think it's probably time to end this one here. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and whether my assessment of this kit was fair. Don't forget that we have a Model Minutes Model Club, and if you'd like to join the Model Club and get exclusive access to early videos and other perks, check out the links in the description. Massive thanks to these Model Club members for the extra support they give me, allowing me to create consistent content. I'd like to welcome our latest members to the club. They are Steve Whitty and Scotty Mallet. Thanks for joining us. There are other ways to help support the channel if you'd prefer, and again, full information is below the video. The best way to support the channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time. I totally didn't forget that I'd masked the little windows on the bottom of the plane and forgotten to remove those masks until after I edited the video, so yeah, no one will know. No one will know. At least I've done it now.